During World War II, aerial combat became one of the most intense and deadly phases of the conflict. Every flight was critical, and the fates of pilots were often decided in a matter of seconds. Many German pilots who were captured by the Allies experienced a different kind of war, one that involved hardship, survival, and ultimately reflection. Their stories are not just about the loss of war, but also about suffering, dignity, and sometimes reconciliation with new circumstances. In the summer of 1944, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, the situation in Western Europe changed dramatically. The number of aerial clashes between German fighters and American bombers increased as the bombers conducted strategic raids over Germany. These raids involved not only veterans, but also young pilots who were experiencing their first taste of the war. One such young pilot was 23-year-old Hans Klein, who had just completed flight school and had been assigned to a Luftwaffe squadron fighting on the French front. On one of his missions on August 15th, 1944, his Messerschmitt Bf 109 was shot down by an American P-51 Mustang. Hans ejected, but he had no choice but to land on territory controlled by the Allies. I saw my plane explode in the sky. I was horrified, but there was no time to panic. As soon as my parachute opened, I hit the ground and saw American soldiers quickly surrounding me, recalls Hans. I was sure they would shoot me on the spot, but instead they just tied me up and took me under guard. The first hours of captivity for many pilots were incredibly terrifying. Most of them had no idea what would happen to them. However, there are accounts that suggest the treatment of captured pilots was far more courteous than that of regular soldiers. The Americans saw pilots as military personnel, and their treatment was correspondingly less harsh. I was with two other pilots who had also been captured. They immediately took us to a POW camp. At first, they fed us very sparingly, just bread and water. But despite the conditions, we realised that we had a chance to survive, says Hans. At the same time, other soldiers who were captured had much worse conditions. We tried to be polite with the guards to avoid unnecessary conflict. Klein and his companions were transferred to a prisoner of war camp for officers, where conditions were better than for regular soldiers. However, even here, life was hard. Cold barracks, limited access to food and water. They were often forced to work on heavy labour projects. One of the hardest aspects of captivity for Hans was the inability to communicate with his family. Letters from home arrived very rarely, and when they did, they were subject to intense censorship. Most of the pilots remained isolated from the outside world and had no access to information about the progress of the war. However, one of the few comforts in captivity was that the Allies occasionally organised cultural events to boost the morale of the prisoners. I remember how they showed us films on an old projector. They were in English, but we had already gotten used to it. It was a temporary distraction from the horrors of captivity. Gradually, even amidst these dreadful conditions, the pilots tried to stick together. They shared stories about their flights, discussed strategies, even if they could no longer apply them in war. This became a way for them to preserve their dignity and sense of self-worth. As with many other cases, the possibility of a return home for the captured pilots often hinged on prisoner exchanges. In Hans's case, negotiations for his return were slow, as there was no direct agreement between Germany and the US for military prisoner exchanges, and it was always a matter of complex diplomatic talks. After several months in the camp, they sent me and a few other pilots to another camp, where we were expected to be exchanged for Soviet POWs that we had been holding in Germany, Hans recalls. It was a tough decision because we didn't know how much longer we would stay in captivity. But we held on to hope that it would finally end. When Hans finally returned to Germany after the war, He was no longer the same young pilot he had been before the war. He had been changed by the experiences of captivity and loss. Returning home was difficult, as he had to face the realities of peacetime life. When I came back, I didn't know what to do with myself. I missed the old sense of purpose. The war and captivity had changed me forever. I could no longer be the same person I'd been before, he says. He was not alone in feeling this way. Many captured pilots, upon returning home, faced difficulties in adapting because the experiences of war had left deep marks on their psyches.